Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here to give this invited keynote talk about do photons show gender bias. This is an unusual keynote talk at a technical conference, and I was explicitly asked to talk about science and gender issue. Why do we have a gender topic during this keynote? I will give an update on my ultrafast laser research and how it affected me as a woman and why I made these career choices. My journey in ultrafast laser started nearly 40 years ago. As a child of the 60s and 70s, I was convinced that discrimination was not an issue anymore and that I could achieve anything based on my performance. Today, I have changed my mind and I would like to explain this. And I actually think the situation can be more serious for women in leadership today. And I want to show for both men and women that when we improve on these issues, it is better for us all. Throughout this talk, I will bring examples from my own life. For people who have not read too much material on gender issues, I recommend this one paper, which is actually written by a man, even though the message may be slightly disturbing for newcomers. In this talk, I would like to address my peers. I have done just recently a talk for mentees and mentors addressing some of the same issues and certain topics, and I cannot cover here. And I would actually recommend to everybody to also see that talk. You will receive a copy of this talk, so you will have access to all the information that I'm presenting here. I studied at ETH Zurich and received a diploma in 1984, which is equivalent to a master. I graduated top of the class and I achieved this outstanding result because I was motivated to win a fellowship to go abroad. In Stanford, I was meeting the first woman professor in my whole career, and actually she helped me to find the right professor for me. I could start my independent research lab right after my PhD. I became a member of technical staff, and I also benefited from some additional help for women scientists, which was based on a lawsuit from a former MTS. And I received a formal mentor, and I was also able to be part of a regular lunch meeting other women where we could exchange our experiences. Both of these programs were actually very useful for me. During all this time, I was guided and rewarded by performance, and I was able to actually turn anger based on perceived injustice into more work to show them that I can do it. And then after Bell Labs, I was recruited to ETH. There was political pressure to hire more women at ETH Zurich in Switzerland because of a Swiss national woman demonstration in 1991. I was a little bit concerned that this is actually a woman position, but Anthony Johnson and other MTS at Bell Labs encouraged me to take it, and I'm very grateful for this advice. Up to this point, practically all my role models were men. I learned from the best, and I worked goal and result oriented. As a professor at ETH, I was not anymore rewarded for performance. And I believe that I was actually sidelined by my male colleagues for pushing for success and resources like a man. Let me show you how I ended up doing all this work coming from SESAMs to ultimately attosecond science and frequency metrology, and what was actually the driving force behind it. When I was at Bell Labs, my initial job assignment was to do something different than anybody else, but it better be good. And the outcome was really, I did invent the SESAM. Very often, people were experts in diode-pumped solid-state lasers or semiconductor physics, but not very often in both. So the SESAM was a very successful innovation. And so I invented this SESAM, which is a semiconductor layered structure with an integrated saturable absorber, which had a much stronger loss modulation with a shorter time window, which enabled shorter pulses, better stability, and was, of course, much easier because it didn't require any of this active input. This SESAM resolved a long-term problem, which was also described by Hermann Haus, a leader at that time. In this paper, Hermann Haus wrote that stable passive mode locking is unachievable for this type of solid-state laser, and steady-state passive mode locking is prevented by relaxation oscillation. So I really solved a problem. When I moved to ETH, I used this invention and pushed ultrafast laser performance with this SESAM. Initially, when I was at ETH, there was no shared clean room facility. In addition to the SESAM mode locking scaling, I also expanded into more fundamental research as a professor. So I pushed the frontier in short pulse generation based on Thai sapphire laser. So by pushing the frontier, we reached a limit in the near infrared regime. And to go to even short pulses, we needed to go into higher frequency. This could be achieved with high harmonic generation. And so I expanded into high harmonic generation and built up an Otto line at ETH. I did a sabbatical in Lund with Anne Lullier, who was a leader in this field, to learn the techniques. Basically, building it up required quite some efforts, which took some time. I needed more resources than the simple SESAM mode locking, but luckily the Swiss National Science Foundation started new programs, which are the so-called NZCRs. So with all these efforts, I have then more than my fair share of lab space within the physics department. And it has been even suggested by my colleagues that I accumulated too much power. I will come back to this. By going to optosecond science and pushing the frontiers in pulse duration, we also encountered a new problem, because the position of the electric field underneath the pulse envelope is actually not stabilized within a mode-locked laser. So there is arbitrary fluctuations in the position of the electric field. And if you only have a few cycles, then the position of the electric field underneath the pulse envelope changes the peak electric field, which really is a huge noise generation in high harmonic generation. Problem was actually recognized in the ultrafast laser community. It was discussed in 1995 at the Gordon Conference, and it was even considered the holy grail in ultrafast laser, and everybody wanted to solve this problem. At that Gordon Conference, we did not come up with a solution. We just all agreed that this is a cool goal to work for. We found the solution in collaboration with Tele in 1999, which we published. And it was very hard to receive proper credit for our work. The problem of stabilizing the electric field underneath the pulse envelope was actually solved by stabilizing the frequency cone. Solving this problem also got me into another field and another invention, because it allowed me to invent the Otto clock technique. So as you can see, I have been exploring the frontiers. I have found new problems, and the problems were always opening up new research fields. So I kept expanding my research effort, and it was always motivated by cool problems and justified by excellent results. I also tried other things, which I dropped because I didn't see the success there. And so my group grew, and I required more lab space and resources, and I became a serious competition and a problem for my colleagues at ETH. Let me explain a little bit more about these optically pumped VECSELs. The motivation for optically pumped semiconductor lasers is power scaling, because you have an external cavity, you can also put in a SESAM to mode lock then this laser. So this is motivated by our work in dye-pumped solid-state lasers. We have written a review article in 2006 and then more recently in 2015 about this work. And the MIXSEL really opened up the possibilities for dual-com mode locking, because the pulse repetition rate in this MIXSEL is given by the external cavity. So for example, for a 3 gigahertz pulse repetition rate, you need about a 5 centimeter external cavity. So this makes it very hard to do it in a fully integrated device. So we use a diode laser to pump this MIXSEL chip. And if all the parameters are set right, then you get a mode-locked pulse train out of this extended laser cavity with a pulse repetition rate given by the round-trip time of a pulse inside this cavity. By pumping a second spot on the MIXSEL chip and introducing a biofrequency crystal, you can actually support 2 mode-locked pulse trains with a slightly different pulse repetition rate, because in this birefringent crystal, you have a different path lengths for the ordinary and the extraordinary beam. So that gives you 2 mode-locked pulse trains with an adjustable difference in the pulse repetition rate. And because all the parts are shared, these pulse trains have a very good stability, which can be used for this dual-com application. So let me show that with regards to dual-com spectroscopy with this example here. So you have a gas cell here where you want to measure the optical absorption. So you take one comb from this dual-com source and let it run through the gas cells where you see the absorption as shown here. And then you use the other comb as a reference signal, which you bring into interference at a photodetector, where the beat signal between the 2 combs then translates this absorption signal into the microwave comb. So this measurement goes extremely fast because it's given by the difference in the pulse repetition rate, but you need these 2 frequency combs. So by taking this dual-com MIXSEL, we could actually show that we can do it from this one laser. We didn't need any further stabilization, get the measurements done. So this was a paradigm shift in a dual-com spectroscopy, because before you needed 2 mode-locked lasers for stabilization loops to stabilize the frequency combs in both lasers. All our earlier work was done with indium gallium arsenide gain materials operating around 1 micron. And there is, of course, a strong interest for the long wavelength regime in spectroscopy. And in 2019, I started a second ERC advanced grant pushing this technology into the long wavelength regime based on gallium antimonide materials. I recently had a plenary talk to discuss about the material and design optimizations for SESAMs and these optically pumped semiconductor. And this plenary talk is actually available online under this link and gives much more details than I can cover now in this special plenary talk. With the funding of the new ERC grant, I could start a new effort with a new team, and we got already some first key milestones. We grew very high quality SESAMs. These SESAMs were so good that world record results were achieved with dye-pumped solid-state lasers at a 2.4 micrometer, both at 250 megahertz and 2 gigahertz. We built VECSELs at 2 micron with 800 milliwatt CW output power. And we did the first mode locking without intracavity heat spreader. And in all cases, we build up the characterization for this work. And we hope we can keep pushing the results. I've had a very successful career, and all excellence markers are there. Many publication, high citation results. I had good group size for many, many years, with typically around 25 PhD students and postdoc. And by the time I'm gonna retire in 3 years, I will reach more than 100 PhD students. So how can I speak about my experience of gender bias and discrimination? In my opinion, gender issues are actually escalating for excellent women, and we need to take and present data and interviews. I will talk about a good role model from MIT, and we need to open a path for a solution with everybody engaged. So let me explain why I'm saying this. There are many challenges and barriers for progress, and these are the topics I would like to discuss with concrete examples. So let me start with the first one, hostile, unwelcoming working culture. When you look at ETH Zurich from 1855 to 2019, you can see that the number of professors has been dominated by male professors, which is shown here in gray. Only very recently, we had the first women professors. I started 1993 here. And by end of 2018-19, we had basically about 14% female full professors and about 25% female assistant professors, even though not all of them are a 10-year track. There is political pressure to increase the women in science, which is required and justified. But the increasing number of excellent women question many established privileges for our male colleagues. And the male-dominated management culture and the informal male networks affect the current working culture. And the current working culture is not very friendly towards women. They don't feel welcome, and very often they're only tolerated with limited resources and power. It is actually well documented and also discussed in this book, which I recommend for reading, is that when women excel in her job, both male and female co-workers will remark that she may be accomplishing a lot, but is not as well liked by her peers. She's probably also too aggressive, not a team player, a bit political, and can't be trusted or difficult. In a hostile working culture, this can result in character assassination, or in German, Rufmord. Because in this case, the women do not get the normal benefit of doubt. So let me show you 3 examples, most recent 3 examples, how bad this can become for women. So these are 3 examples in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. Professor Heike Egner, Professor Tanja Singer as a director of the Max Planck Institute, and Professor Marcella Carollo as a former colleague of mine in the physics department at ETH Zurich. All 3 women had an excellent performance track record, and they all were terminated. The accusation was significant misconduct in management and inappropriate leadership. The accusers remained anonymous, and the allegations were aimed at their personal integrity. And the poor governance without independent grievance processes were responsible for the escalation. In this management magazine published in 2020, these cases were compared, and a German politician commented in this article, this is a career risk, especially for women. So why do we have this escalation of hostility against women? And this is partially triggered by the political pressure to hire more women. This partially results from the perceived feeling of injustice and the feeling of reverse discrimination of many male colleagues. So reverse discrimination means that now white males are discriminated in the selection process for a professor position, for example. I believe that there is a lack of understanding of the current gender issues and the problems, and we need a broader education, because I don't think that this reverse discrimination is true. Actually, there are facts that show that this is not true. But it is important to realize that in the beginning, equal treatment may feel like reverse discrimination, but it's not, because, you know, for the longest time, the men were just within their own group. And now, with the political pressure, these women are coming. But, you know, at this point, women are still a small minority, and the growth is still smaller than with the male colleagues. So an example how you can do a broader education is actually shown in the UK with this Juno type project, specially geared for the physics department, and you find the link here. So let me go to my case in the physics department at ETH. Just as a reminder again, I was hired in 1992 into a tenured professor position within the Institute of Quantum Electronics, which is part of the physics department. I started in March 1993, and remember, I was actually a quota woman, even though at that time there was no official quota effort in Switzerland. But still, the Swiss National Women Demonstration in 1991 increased the political pressure, and I was actually approached for a direct hire when I was still at Bell Labs into this woman position, and I took it. I became the first 10-year woman professor in physics at ETH, and I started off with significantly less resources than average in the institute at that time. There was actually no transparency of the resource distribution within the department. I just realized that later on. I had the written promise for more with good performance and the retirement of all the professors, which I thought at that time was a good deal because I was always rewarded for good performance. So I thought, no problem, I will show. And I also got a promise that there will be a daycare in case I will consider having children. And when I showed up, I was pretty much ignored by my male colleagues. I had some help from Professor Melchior, but he became more and more disgruntled because at the end, he was the only one to give me more space, and that was really hurting him. But at least I really did not need the help of the physics department because I was pretty well prepared by my independent research at Bell Labs for 4 years. And again, I just focused on performance and results. After I was hired, we had also an additional professor hired as an assistant professor. But then for 22 years, all the professor selection committees resulted in hiring a male professor with 24 to 0. On the level of the permanent senior scientist, the ratio was 33 to 1. Only through dual career appointment, we actually increased the number of tenure professors by 1, Marcella Carolla. 2017, Professor Simon Lilly became department head. He is the husband of Marcella Carolla and initiated an emergency program to appoint female tenure track faculty, because by then it became clear that, you know, as the senior professors were coming closer and closer to retirement, there will be soon no women left in the physics department. 2019, the department had a crisis and Professor Carollo was terminated. This Carollo case was very controversially discussed in the media and is currently at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court. But because of this crisis, the department was convinced to do something, and within 2 years, we hired 5 tenure-track women assistant professors. And some people were even surprised how excellent the candidates were. So let me address the next point, family and care commitments. Let me first start with my case. When I got pregnant in 1996, my promotion from associate to full professor was actually interrupted. And I was questioned if I could do my job with children. It resulted in a big mess within the physics department. I got some help from some people, and there was quite a dispute about this. But finally, after 4.5 years after my start as an associate professor, I was promoted to a full professor. And when I compare myself to my peers, at that time, all of them male, they were promoted after 3 years and all had young children, and all of them had no problem in their promotion. I definitely believe you can do a career and have children. We've done it. I've done it with my husband. This is a picture from my family with my 2 kids. But you need special measures because having children is not business as usual. You need reliable daycare and you need additional support in case of sickness and when you have important work deadlines and all these kind of things. And the woman really needs to focus on the essential task and receive additional help during this baby phase because you cannot work 150 to 200% in this phase. But this can be managed, and there are many examples listed here. I have no doubt that this can be managed if the leadership wants to do it. Let me go to the next point. You also need resources to be successful, and you need to have access to resources based on some defined excellence criteria and performance. In my case, unfortunately, my field of research, it was really resource heavy. So I really pushed the limit within the physics department. I'm really convinced if you have limited transparency and accountability with regards to resource distribution, you actually waste resources and it hurts the science community in general. And of course, the minorities are hurt much more by bad governance. Again, going back to my case, when I was hired in 1992, I was actually promised in writing in my employment contract that I will get more resources with good performance and when needed. After my promotion dispute, I was actually marginalized within the physics department. I was considered a troublemaker. I had no space increase, no info, no leadership position, and I was personally threatened, losing goodwill with the head of the institute. It took me about 10 years to have a comparable level of space as newly hired colleagues after me from the start. So let me show the data. This is the number of PhD students and postdocs over the years in red here, growing ever since the start of my hire. And in blue, you have the total space that I received. As you can see, I received about half of the space of my colleagues when they started. And of course, the older generation of professors even had more. The lines here are the moments when my 2 kids were born, and you can see that I had a plateau in the number of people and in the space. And here I started the new effort in attosecond science, and I have been fighting for more space, which I finally got. But you can see that even though the number of people have been growing, my total space did not increase. And so I had to give up office space to accommodate for the lab space to simply be able to do my job. It actually even pushed me into a regime where I did a sabbatical here at UC Berkeley, where I seriously considered leaving ETH. I was losing goodwill from the ETH president also, because after the birth of my first child, during this whole battle with the promotion, I lost the goodwill in my department. And then I had a second kid, and the president changed, and I had again problems with access to ETH daycare. And I asked the new president for help, because the first one promised me the space and really helped me. But the new president did not consider this necessary. The new president was also not supportive of my request for more resources. He even went as far as telling me that I should keep quiet. In a meeting where I was hoping I would get help from him, together with my husband, he told me I should keep quiet or else I will lose his goodwill, the goodwill of the full leadership of ETH and many other people in Switzerland. He even repeated this several times because I just was sitting there and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the first time in my life I was actually really scared. I mean, I had just 2 young children. My husband just started a company. We actually relied on me being the responsible person for the family income. This was in principle against the law of equal rights in Switzerland, but there was nowhere to go and ask for help. The legal grievance processes takes many years and costs around 300 to 500,000 Swiss francs, which you have to pay on your own as an individual, and pretty much kills your career. In 1999, after this threat, because I have this strong sense of justice, I had a hard time to cope with this. I really considered leaving after all. But then there was a rescue. And the rescue came from MIT, because during the same time period, there were senior women professors at MIT. They got organized and reported about discrimination in resource distribution and culture to the president. And the MIT president started a more detailed survey. At the end, an MIT report was published in 1999, acknowledging gender discrimination, and MIT announced additional measures. One sentence here really resonated with me, where the president said, "However, I sat bolt upright in my chair when a senior woman who has felt unfairly treated for some time said, I also felt very positive when I was young." Reading this report really helped me. Basically, it helped me to stay in academia. I realized I'm not alone, and it is not my fault that I did not feel welcome in my department. And so I was just determined to keep going and focus on my success, with the hope that hopefully one day I will be treated with respect. In hindsight, I was lucky that I started my career in applied research, because SESAM mode locking was a success story with real customers, not just the peers. It had a high impact with large industrial relevance and a high citation record. Basically, building a laser is a measurable result, which reduces the gender bias in peer review. I will come back to this, because in principle, you know, if you build a better laser, it doesn't matter if it's done by a woman or a man. And the good funding that we had with the high acceptance rate actually also helped in the gender bias, because at the beginning, at that time in the National Science Foundation in Switzerland, the acceptance rate for individual grants were 80 to 50%. So at the end, I can really say photons do not show gender bias. If you build a better laser, measure better power, shorter pulses, it doesn't matter who built this laser. Let me explain this bias in peer review and also the grievance process. So I'll use these 2 examples. This is an important slide from the Swiss National Science Foundation, which clearly shows that peer review is not gender blind. Let me explain this. This is a mean score for a proposal by a reviewer. And this is the result of 40,000 reviewers in project funding. And here is the gender of the reviewer. And red is the results of the mean scores for female proposals and blue for the male proposals. So what you can see, both women and men are rating females' proposals lower. The only difference is that the gap between the male and the female proposals is smaller with the women, but not by much. And so if you have a really small acceptance rate, this small difference in the mean score can really hurt your success rate for funding. Solution for such problems is that you can get the gender data first in the reviewing. You have to have well-defined evaluation criteria and reduce the conflict of interest in peer review. At the end, this becomes easier with more women proposal. You can actually make a correction of the scores for the gender bias. You can also limit the number of funded grants per PI because that increases the acceptance rate. So let me give you another example out of my history, which is actually relevant for today, about the grievance processes. For example, in 2006, I was declared incompetent in attosecond science by my colleagues. I received a written letter from the director of the NZCR, where I got the funding to start the attosecond science, to stop funding because a postdoc is leaving, because the project was jeopardized. This is the situation in 2006. What is different compared to my male colleagues? Postdocs are normally coming and going. This is business as usual for a professor. Every professor is expected to be competent to organize personnel. And I did not know a single case of a male professor who was told to stop spending money because a postdoc was leaving. And I received this letter even without ever anybody talking to me. This was definitely not business as usual, and especially not with my track record. I had no apologies, and ultimately funding was cut in the next phase of the NZCR. You know, the fact was that an overly ambitious postdoc could convince my colleagues that I do not understand anything about physics, and it is best to transfer part of my lab to his new lab because he was awarded an independent professor position. My key success after the postdoc left in 2006 was the invention of the Atto clock in 2008, for which I received my first ERC grant. Why did I survive? The postdoc actually made a mistake. He treated my PhD students very badly. HR investigations based on the request of the PhD student and myself resulted in a very poor evaluation for the postdoc. And this report from Human Resources was also shared with the department, and the department head at that time helped after he read this report, mostly motivated to protect the students, not mainly me. And at that time, a professor position was still quite a power position, and the professors were in principle well protected. But similar situations happen to women even today, more than 10 years later. It's very similar to this case, but with much worse outcomes, because these overly ambitious postdocs also learned from each other how to do this. We need additional measures and political leadership pressure for a culture change. When I stepped up to a leadership position and became a director of the NZCR MAST, I also was empowered with resources to do something for the advancement of women. I hired one person, Dr. Anna Gary, to help me with this effort. And we started a new column with the OSA magazine together with Professor Anthony Johnson. Remember, he's the one who encouraged me to take the woman position at ETH, on reflections on diversity. And before the first column was published, I also published an OSA viewpoint in February 2011. I basically wrote, at this point in my career, I have earned the respect of my colleagues. I have put in the work to establish a long career. If I, as a senior female science professor, cannot speak up strongly for change, who can? This National Center of Competence in Switzerland are long-term research efforts with quite a lot of funding. The goal is to empower a new or old research structure. So we came up with a FAST lab as a new shared ultrafast laser technology platform. Then we should demonstrate education on an industrial outreach and advancement of women and equal opportunity. When I took this leadership, I was the first woman director of any NCR in Switzerland, and we did it in a co-leading approach. I shared the leadership with Professor Thomas Feurer at the University of Bern. As a director, you receive additional resources when you take over this leadership. This was actually essential for maintaining both the SESAM mode locking and the attosecond science. And we received excellent reviews for our management and PI satisfaction, and our advancement for women effort were considered an outstanding role model for all NZCRs. One outcome of our efforts was, for example, the creation of the Women Professor Forum. This was, of course, motivated by the MIT report. As of 2013, 75% of all women professors became members. One of the most effective measures for change was to start a survey, which was then followed by official survey both in ETH and EPFL. This survey showed that at least 23 female professors felt discriminated within the previous 2 years at ETH Zurich. Male-dominated management culture and predominance of men in numbers and in leadership positions affected women disproportionately. Not sufficient accountability and transparency with regards to resource and space allocation, committee work, teaching load, and most importantly, the decision-making process was considered a real issue. Then the grievance processes were considered generally not good by both men and women, but for women in particular, rated the complaints process for discrimination as rather negative to very negative. And also the duration of the grievance process is a source of undue stress, and the substantial financial burden that goes into this also gives strong indication for academic mobbing. The conflict of interest for professors involved in the process was a real issue because very often retired professors with their informal network actually were part or were leading the grievance processes. And there was a lack of protection of professors from frivolous accusations. And I'll give you examples of what that really means. Here are the links for these the reviews which are published. I consider especially the EPFL report as very useful because that was based on real interviews. So you have a little bit more information. The published report is a little bit whitewashed, but there is actually a more detailed report for internal use at EPFL. Unfortunately, it's confidential. I actually think there is a lot of learning material that would help the broader community to better understand the problems. The role model MIT was published in 1999. And so we now also had published reports more than 20 years later. But the current challenge with the leadership at many European universities and institutions is that the leadership is more concerned about the potential reputational damage rather than fixing the problem. The example of MIT actually showed that there was no reputational damage. MIT is still #1. In the contrary, with this reaction of the president at that time, it made MIT look strong. And the president received a lot of respect for his reaction, and it changed the culture for many women. I'm very concerned that our current leadership tends to use their power to keep women quiet and even punish women who dare to stand up for change. In my case, I stepped up for a culture change ever since I became a director of NCTR MAST. I also received the additional resources to do this. And I was stepping up in protection for many women and some male professor colleagues suffering from escalating problematic grievance processes ever since 2017. The Carollo case was the first one. This resulted in personal penalties for me within ETH. Let me give you examples of bad working culture for women. Women and outsider groups often have lower mistake tolerance and are punished more strongly for them. And the lack of independent grievance procedures, minor mistake, or even made up issues become weaponized, totally blown out of proportions. I've seen so many of my male colleagues doing much worse and never were punished as much as I have seen women punished. So this supports a management culture of intimidation. Unequal treatment, depending on how many friends one has in leadership, this does not support excellent and wastes resources. And it has also affected male professors. It did not just happen with women, but bad governance always hurts the underrepresented group first. I really like this quote by Albert Einstein: "A person who never made a mistake never tried anything new." You know, I never seen a perfect manager. It would be nice if this also applies for women scientists. Examples of a hostile culture and a culture of intimidation is when disgruntled group member become weaponized to hurt a woman, or administrative investigation, or scientific misconduct accusation. And when women are actually punished when they stand up for change or in protection for other women. Weaponizing a disgruntled group member already started with the Carollo case in 2017, but that case was only one out of many. Within our Women Professor Forum network, we heard of many other cases where disgruntled or frustrated PhD student or overly ambitious postdoc have been used to increase pressure on unwanted professors. This happened to both senior women and young assistant professors. And these undesirable, unwanted professors become mobbing target by colleagues and even the leadership of the university because of these informal networks. This also can happen to male colleagues. This is something to remember. An example, as summarized by a medical doctor, is shown here. This is translated into English.
I was intrigued by the succession of women professors of the same profile coming to consult me for the same reasons. For a state of physical and mental exhaustion linked to a work environment that is both hostile and threatening to them. They describe a climate in which the slightest action on their part triggers an investigation. They are then asked to justify themselves on a whole series of points. These strangely repetitive investigations endanger their academic careers. That such ambitious women are arriving in a state of health for my consultation both dismays and worries me. It is not a distress that can be explained by the psychology of the specific individual. It is indeed a small epidemic in an internationally recognized school. I find this both sad and disillusioning.
These repetitive investigations are very often based on so-called administrative investigations. These administrative investigations are normally used to collect facts. However, many of these investigations have been used as an effective disciplinary investigation against certain professors. And these administrative investigations actually limit the rights of an individual under investigation, I mean the target, in comparison to a real disciplinary investigation. And the large power and economic mismatch between the university and the individual is also indicative of mobbing the target. Examples are shown here. These are published examples. I have personally experienced such investigations both as a witness and a target. And I'm happy to answer questions to all of them. In my case, when I was a target, which is the so-called BDO administrative investigation, this was happening at the same time with an official investigation from the Eidgenössische Finanzkontrolle, so it's the Swiss Federal Finance Control. That report actually was in disagreement, partial disagreement with this BDO AU, and that actually really saved me in hindsight. If all these investigations didn't help yet to have this unwanted professor leaving, then very often the pressure was increased with additional scientific misconduct accusation. Because these unwanted professors are pressured to leave the university or even sign a non-disclosure agreement. And these additional attempts of scientific misconduct was really used to increase the pressure so that they're finally leaving. And that happened both at ETH and at EPFL. And actually, we know cases at other European universities and institutes. Let me go back to the example of Marcella Carollo, which I know pretty well. Marcella was accused by some group member about some image manipulation. The figure in question was never published and was simply used to illustrate a well-known fact. A formal investigation was started after a while, and a preliminary evaluation by the confidant, which is not an independent person in this process, it's a retired professor, resulted actually in more charges with regards to a possible scientific misconduct. So this confidant now also became an accuser. The start of this formal investigation was actually publicly announced under this link, and that this formal investigation is justified based on the preliminary results. This additional escalation in the grievance process was used to relieve her of all the duties. All people in her group were removed from her. By this point, character assassination, Rufmord, was accomplished. There was no need for this public announcement in principle, and actually hurts the person very strongly. And then there was no need to speed up the clarification of the accusation because Professor Carollo received never the detailed information so that she could actually defend herself, because discussing authorship requires actually to identify the paper in question. Only after 10 months, she received the necessary details of accusation, and she was asked to respond to all of those accusations within 11 days. No possible extensions. She did it. A detailed 70-page response was submitted on time by Professor Carollo. After about 1 year, the investigation committee submitted to ETH leadership there had been no scientific misconduct. And Professor Marcella Carollo was still at ETH. And at that point, the ETH president requested to terminate Professor Carollo in a ETH news in March 2019. I really would recommend this book. In this book, it is also shown that many highly educated and talented women are opting out of their careers because they are rejecting the workplace. Actually, there is a 2017 Forbes report which showed that women leave the tech field at a rate that is 45% higher than men. These are all lost opportunities and is hurting us all. Unfortunately, when women actively promote other women, they often face career penalties. Not even white male executives receive any career-related advantage for actually working to create diversity. So let me go back to my case. I experienced increased academic mobbing after 2017. I watched my only senior woman professor colleague, Ursula Keller, being fired, and I tried for 2 years with ETH internal efforts to help her. And then finally, I accepted a public interview, which was published in 2019. I lost more goodwill with the current leadership, and I also received an official first notice before termination in 2019. I'm actually also on federal court with this case. I also was exposed to ETH internal investigations. My finances were investigated over 10 years. I became a target of an administrative investigation. There were attempted accusations of scientific misconduct. There are attempts to cancel research funding, both ETH internally and Swiss National Science Foundation. And as you remember, when I started my directorship 2010, and in my viewpoint article, I wrote 2011, if I, as a senior female science professor, cannot speak up strongly for change, who can? I still want to ask that question. If this all would have happened in the middle of my career, it pretty much would have killed my career. There are books written about these issues. I read both of them, and I can highly recommend them. Can we solve these challenges? I believed it in 2010, and I still believe it now. Let me give a few enabling steps in my final view graph. What steps can we do to improve the current situation? First of all, we need independent checks and independent grievance procedures for sufficient oversight and ultimate credibility in the existing university culture. We need to continue to increase the number of women using special measure as needed. The target should be more than 30% because that has been shown that by then the women have a chance to affect the working culture. We need more efforts on retention, performance, promotion, and culture change. These additional efforts to achieve real culture change need structures and real benefits, rather than negative feedback for engaging on these issues for both men and women. We also need to increase the motivation, so there could be access to more funding with better governance. And the better governance is important to weaken these informal networks, which happened to be mostly male at this point. These networks, when unchecked, tend to hurt overall excellence, waste resources, and hurt the scientific community in general. For the benefit of us all and good science, we need more help from our male colleagues, because when we manage to introduce this better governance, this will also help the men, and it will help science. When we try harder, we can actually do better. For 22 years, every selection committee in my department selected a man with 24-0, and within 2 years, we found 5 excellent tenure-track women assistants. So the women are there. We just need to hire them. But this requires a real commitment from our leadership with measurable results. These are not expensive measures, and this will benefit everybody. So I hope I could give a more detailed explanation why the situation is severe. And I hope that we can engage everybody for a solution. Thank you very much.